All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in another session of BC Forests, the People's Convergence. Today, we're going to have a really interesting in-depth talk with Ray Travers and Bob Williams. And I'm here with my co-organizer again, Taryn Skalbania. Welcome, Ray. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning and good to be with you all.
Welcome, Bob. Thank you.
Hi there.
And Taryn, thank you so much again for being a fantastic co-organizer in our sessions here. I'm speaking to you from Grand Forks, which is the traditional unceded territory of the Bilik and the Sinixt and the Ktunaxa people. Ray.
Speaking from the Wasanic traditional territory, the origins of the district of Saanich.
Taryn.
Hi, I'm speaking from the unceded historical territory of the Syilx people. It's known to us as Lake Okanagan.
Hi, I'm Bob Williams, and I'm speaking from the unceded territory of the Squamish, the Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh people.
So I'll just do a very brief introduction of Taryn and Ray, and then Ray's going to go through his presentation with us. And then Bob will do a presentation with us, and then we'll ask some questions along the way here. So Taryn is currently living in Peachland, but she grew up in East and West Vancouver, and she's currently managing a hobby farm with her husband Rob in Peachland. Taryn volunteers for various community groups, including the Peachland Residents Association, the Mayor's Compost Committee, the BC Coalition for Forestry Reform, and the Peachland Watershed Protection Alliance. When Taryn came to the Okanagan, she was shocked and appalled at the industrial and multi-use of the backcountry, especially the unrestricted use of a community watershed. And it was this unbalance that has driven Taryn to co-found the Peachland Watershed Protection Alliance. They work towards educating and informing Peachland residents on the threats and pressures on their watershed. So thank you so much for being with us again, Taryn. All right, Ray Travers, I'm so honored that you're here with us today. Ray has been a wonderful mentor to me over the past 2 years. He spent a lot of time on the phone with me, helping me to learn about this complex forestry thing we got going on in BC. So Ray Travers is a retired registered forestry professional. He was born in McBride, BC. He has a Bachelor's of Science in Forestry from UBC and a Master's in Forestry from Oregon State University. He's worked as an environmental forester for the British Columbia Forest Products on Vancouver Island. He's been a district superintendent for Indian and Northern Affairs in Inuvik, Northwest Territories. He's been a planning forester for the province of BC. And he currently works as a private forestry consultant based in Victoria. Ray is an advocate for ecologically sustainable forestry and regional management of public forests. He welcomes First Nations and others, acting like the owners we are of our vast, magnificent public forests located on 94% of British Columbia. Ray believes we need effective action in our forests, to stop doing what is not working, and to incrementally improve what is. Thank you so much, Ray. So I'm going to pull up your screen, your slides right now.
And I will ask you to move to the next one when I'm ready.
Okay, that sounds really good. So the title for this is Restoration Forestry, a Lifeline. So over to you, Ray.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jennifer. It's great to be with everyone this morning. Time has run out. There's no time to delay, especially with COVID-19. The message is clear, and that is that humanity's putting too much stress on nature, and we have to find ways to reduce that stress so that we can find long-term sustainable solutions. This presentation is intended to be a lifeline, to throw some ideas in the direction of anyone who's interested or concerned, but especially to the citizens of British Columbia. A lifeline is, in real life, is a rope that's thrown to someone in distress. For people like myself, we've seen the current crisis in BC forestry coming for decades. And it is no joy, from my point of view, to have to say, I told you so. I became a forester way back when because I wanted to be a custodian of forests. And I welcome this opportunity to share my current ideas with you on how we can meet today's challenges and move to a better life and a better world, especially in our forests here in British Columbia. My underlying worldview, and it's taken me a long time to get here, that happily on this wonderful planet we live in, it's ultimately a highly creative place. That all the problems that humanity faces are of our own making. And that if we can understand how nature works and learn how to align our human values with it, ultimately there is really no real limit to the good things that we can accomplish. And so this presentation is going to be a snapshot about how we can do that. Next, please. We'll need new skills and for a new time. One of my mentors is a fellow by the name of Don Campbell, who lives in Meadow Lake, Saskatchewan, and he's a rancher. And he's been doing the kind of things that I've just been mentioning to help people in the ranching community get out of the industrial paradigm of agriculture and into a holistic ecological paradigm. And one of the statements that he made is right here in front of us. If you want to achieve small things, change the way you do things. If you want to achieve big things, change the way we see things. And one of the best ways for this topic to change the way we see things is to change our definition of sustainability. And if you can see this formula here in italics from a fellow by the name of Robert Bailey with the US Forest Service, he has redefined sustainability. Usually it's defined in terms of the first factor here, resource productivity. What other far-thinking ecologists like Bailey have said, we have to learn how nature self-renews and how it self-repairs and how it sustains itself. And when we learn to understand that, we'll move towards the potential. So the new approach that I am very much an advocate is, when we think of sustainability, it's all about working with nature. It's not about controlling nature or assuming that we can predict centuries into the future as the existing model does. Next slide. This is, of course, our beautiful province. And we have 12 biogeoclimatic zones in British Columbia. There are only 15 biogeoclimatic zones in all of Canada, and we have 12 of them right here. They go from the coast here to the wet, to the dry and the yellow, from the hot to the cool in the robin egg blue in the north, and then it goes from low elevations to high elevations everywhere where you have mountains in BC. Next slide. One of the things that I wish we were ecologically literate on in many respects in British Columbia, but the way that nature renews itself and keeps itself healthy is through natural disturbances. And these natural disturbances historically here on the coast have been wind, in the interior have been fire, have been insects, and more recently, of course, we've had logging, which has also been a part of the disturbance types. And as we go through these 5 disturbance types that we see here, the disturbances go from rare, as you see in NDT1, to infrequent, to frequent, and then to stand maintaining fires. And what that basically means here is that on the coast, we've had almost no fire history out on the outer coast. It's mainly been wind. Here on the coastal Douglas fir zone, yes, we have had some fires, but when we move into the interior, that's where we get all the activity from the mountain pine beetle and the fires, and that's about 1/3 of BC. And then we get into the really dry part of the province where the fires change from stand initiating events, as it says here, to stand maintaining fires. And so when a fire burns in the ponderosa pine grass, bunchgrass zone, especially when we have ponderosa pine with a thick bark which can resist fire, basically it really changes. And then of course we have the high elevation. So when we hear all the politics of BC forestry about all the fires and all the bugs affecting the future forestry, if we were ecologically literate, we would say that happens in ND3 only, okay? ND3 only. And to pretend that the reason that the industry is in trouble just conveniently ignores all the other natural disturbance types. Next, please. Okay, our single biggest problem as people are paradigms. Examples of paradigms are things like, if you like, religion, where we have one worldview versus another worldview. Or if you like, politics between left and right. Basically what a paradigm is that it's, as we see here, it's a set of rules and regulations that defines boundaries and tells you what to do to be successful within these boundaries. So what I'm going to now focus on are two paradigms. One is the plantation paradigm with its set of rules and regulations, and the other is the ecosystem, which has its own set of rules and boundaries. So next, please. One of the great people in ecological forestry was Ole Leopold. He was a US forester, was born in 1887, as I recall. He died early at age 61 when he was fighting a fire on his property and didn't survive that. But he wrote a magnificent book, well, many books, but in the Sand County Almanac, which was published after he died, he defined conservation. And that's really my guiding concept in all of this. So conservation as a term has been around for 100 years. But let's reflect carefully. Conservation defined. Health is the capacity of the land for self-renewal. Self-renewal. Nature doesn't need us, ultimately. It'll take care of itself. Conservation is our effort to understand and preserve this capacity. And so that's what our real challenge is, if we're going to make this paradigm change, is to understand in a significant way what conservation means as an idea, but also in practice. Next, please. The way I'm advocating for the lifeline, the way I'm advocating to practice restoration forestry is to change our paradigm. The beautiful thing about restoration forestry is pay as we go. In other words, we don't defer costs to the future. We don't have hidden costs. And then when it comes to the method for achieving sustainability, we favor selection logging over clear cutting. The hidden costs, let's go next slide. Occur when we remove products or part of the ecosystem. So when we clear cut, we remove logs. That should be obvious to everybody. But also what we remove are nutrients, and especially what we remove is diversity. We basically, above ground, reduce the forest to zero. Get that? We reduce the above ground forest to zero. That should be plain and simple, but that doesn't seem to be a part of our understanding of that particular concept. The whole idea of restoration is to follow nature blueprint, which maintains a self-repairing, self-sustaining forest. In practice, what it means is we manage for vigor. Ecological foresters spend a lot of time by looking at the crowns of trees to seeing how green they are, or how yellow they are, or sometimes how dead the branches are. And basically what works best is to leave the best trees, the most vigorous, and to remove the stress trees. But by doing that in mixed species stems, which is the dominant, at least 75%, it creates growing space for the live trees that remain. And we can talk more about that later. Next, please. Here's plantation management. I've already talked about the first and the second and the third. Next slide. I made a presentation in Duncan 2 years ago, and one of the politicians got up and said, the mountain facing Duncan, Mount Prevost, was completely clear-cut logged. And look at it today. is a wonderful Douglas fir forest on that slope. So don't tell me that clear cutting is bad. And so what this slide does, and it's prepared by Chris Mazur, a very good US forest ecologist, and it compares old growth forests, if we can see it up here on the left with a little symbols in it, and then you'll see YGF into the 1, 2, 3, and that's the amount of ecological flexibility that there is, and that depends on the stored nutrients and so on, and the ecological process, the way that water moves, the way that microbes interact with trees and so on. But you'll see that there's, in this concept here, and I believe this came from data from Europe, yes, there is a flush of nutrients in the very young forest, but as time goes on, basically those are depleted, and ultimately they become much less than what we have in the old growth forest. And the reason for that is that we have diminished the capacity of that site through clear cutting to self-renew the nutrients. Next slide, please. Aldo Leopold had a wonderful way of using words. And I'm going to now take you through quickly how we can think about ecosystems in a different way to understand how they really work. Aldo Leopold said, "Here's the land is not merely soil. It is a fountain of energy flowing through a circuit of soils, plants, and animals." Okay? And basically what he's put the emphasis on is the movement of energy. Next slide, please. This is what Aldo Leopold called the ecological pyramid. I hope you can see the details, but on the bottom of the pyramid, it shows a forest with the trees. And then the second line, it shows the primary consumers, those wildlife that eat vegetation. And then we move on to the secondary consumers, those that eat other animals. And then at the peak, we have, in this case, a grizzly bear that depends on everything below it. And there are other, I guess they call them umbrella species that can be like that. In the bird world, you know, goshawks and birds like that will be there. But basically what we need to understand is that there's energy captured by the sun that starts with the fountain base of this pyramid, and then as we move up, that energy is discharged ultimately to the atmosphere, and it gets less and less and less as we move up the food chain. Next, please. Here's the water cycle that's familiar to us all, but one of the key things that I want you to see here is the sun that drives it. And there are these various processes that operate, and basically what it is how water changes, let's say from snow to liquid water to atmospheric water. And as the temperature changes, the water cycle continues to work in this circular fashion. Next, please. And here's the nutrient cycles. And we can see the different nutrients represented here. The carbon that's taken for the trees through the atmosphere. Of course, the carbon will ultimately wind up as humus in the soils, and then ultimately it'll get transformed into nutrients, and then ultimately go back to the atmosphere. And the same thing happens with all the other nutrients. There are nutrient cycles not only for carbon, but for nitrogen and every other nutrient. Next, please. And of course, the fourth part, in terms of how an ecosystem works, is that it changes through time, through different stages, and it changes from the early phase after disturbance into the stand initiation phase. And there are certain characteristic animals that live with that, deer and rabbits and lynx and so on. And then there's the crowding phase, the stem exclusion phase. Industrial forestry only looks to this far. It completely writes off everything to the right in industrial forestry. But the potential, which I referred to earlier on in that Bailey definition, includes all this. And so it moves, and then of course the understory comes from species of trees that can grow in the shade of the other trees, like spruce in the northern interior, like cedar and hemlock in the wet belt, and so on. And then what happens is that eventually the forest changes and develops, especially with the a lot of diversity, and the animals that depend on this type of habitat are very different. That's where the mountain caribou come in. That's where the woodpeckers come in. That's where the spotted owl comes in, and the marble murrelet. They have highly developed habitat characteristics, and if there are no old growth trees, those species will disappear. Next, please. Aldo Leopold had this marvelous way of using language. We have to think big. He says we have to think like a mountain. That should be second nature to us in BC. But every time we see a mountain, we've got to think big. And it means here is to have a complete appreciation of the profound interconnectedness of the elements of an ecosystem. Yes, we can understand fairly easily what these different separate processes are. Our big problem as human beings is understanding how they work together, especially how they work together as a whole system. And that's our huge challenge as we deal with climate change. Next, please. In practical sense, the key is to keep all the parts. He says, if the biota, that's the living world, in the course of aeons, has built something we like but do not understand, to keep every cog and wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering. In other words, if we carelessly throw away all that diversity that I referred to earlier, that's not intelligent thinking. Next, please. Okay, a few more thoughts from Aldo Leopold. Conservation then is keeping the resource in good working order, as well as preventing overuse. He said resources may get out of order before they are exhausted, sometimes while they were still in bond. In other words, we have to have a margin of safety. If we eliminate all the old growth in the managed forest in BC, we will be really crippling our capability to recover from the stresses that we're now living with. And it'll happen, but it'll happen with a lot more time required. Instead of decades, it'll probably be centuries. Next, please. Now we come to the human part. How do we orient our thinking so that we are supportive of a change to the ecological paradigm of forestry, to those ecological practices? Well, this iceberg figure illustrates that for us. It says that what we see on the surface are the practices, but underneath are the principles. In other words, the external, that is external to people, reality of what runs the world. I just gone through all of that, the energy, the water, the nutrients, and so on. But that's not the end of it. It's more complex than that for people. It's the values. It's our internal worlds. It's our belief systems that ultimately will determine what kind of forestry we practice. Next, please. Happily, in theory, this is what we believe as Canadians. I'll let you make up your own mind as to how faithful we are in Canadians, but according to this one source in Ontario, Durham Immigration, they said that we believe in equality, and there's some examples of that. You know, our healthcare system is that. Respect, well, our First Nations would have some trouble accepting that that's what they bump into. I think we do have some evidence that Canadians, at least in terms of our military, we've had, we have been peacekeepers, since the 1950s as peacekeeping forces, and that seems to change between peacekeeping and peacemaking, which is the more military version of that. And then it says nature. This is the theory now. Canadians are known to love our country, to love the land, and we see a fair amount of that, but how much of that do we see in our politics? And then the last two, I do think that they are true. One of my frustrations is that we are always polite to each other when we have meetings, but it's really what happens in between meetings which is important. Then, of course, we all love our hockey. Next, please. Okay, what are some examples as I come to my conclusion here of well-managed forests? And these are all on the internet, and I'll quickly describe the five of them here. There's a private corporation, but it's interesting. They're a family of Methodists, so that means that they have an ethical foundation in their family. But they actually have private land that's managed selectively in many cases in California, Oregon, and Pennsylvania. There are a number of smaller forests, but you have to look for them. Here in BC, we've got Wildwood, which is, I think it's about 100 acres, but there's a nice one in Oregon. Then, of course, here's the Menominee Tribal Enterprises. I have a great deal of pleasure in talking about them, with the Menominee. Basically what happened there was that they got pushed off the agricultural lands during the settlement of the Great Plains by the newcomers. And they simply had to find a way to survive. They had the wisdom of their tribal leadership 150 years ago, as they had to live off the forest, to set up a sustainable forest management plan. And we can talk about that later. Right next door to BC here in Idaho, Montana, and Oregon, on 5% of the states, there are state trust forests. And I'll get into in a minute some of the legal principles, and then there's the Swedes. But basically, they outperform us in every category. Next, please. Okay, what can we do about this in terms of this lifeline? Well, I think we should take a really close look at this, at the legislation by the USA State Trust Forest. Now, first of all, there are 23 states that have trust land legislation, but the only 4 with forests are the 4 that I mentioned. And they have 6 principles that form the foundation of their legislation and policy. They do have flexibility between every state, so every state will be unique in its own way. But these are the 6 principles, and I want to spend a little bit of time on this because I think it's really, really important. The first one is clarity. We need, by law, it needs to be easy to understand. I wonder how many people here in BC say that our forestry is easy to understand. I don't think there'd be many. Accountability. There has to be accepted responsibility by the leadership of a province. It seems to me that we only accept that responsibility under duress. One example of that would be when the province accepted the responsibility to cover planting costs when the Americans forced us to in 1988, because they said if we didn't, that would be another subsidy. Enforceability. Well, in theory, we have the legislation to enforce, but my understanding is that we simply don't have the staff to pay much attention to enforcing the laws. Perpetuity. No. That's not even on our radar. Good judgment, I would say not. And especially, we don't have undivided loyalty in our as an element of the management. And undivided loyalty is defined here: unconditional allegiance to the citizens, the public landowners. In other words, you can't serve 2 masters, and this is what our tenure system here is based on. That somehow we can have good forestry with private tenure and public land. I certainly wouldn't meet that test. Next, please. And this is how I think every executive should evaluate every policy that they're under consideration, with various tests for sustainability. And here are some examples. Does this policy, does it meet the ecological test of ecological integrity? In other words, does it all function together as a whole ecosystem, self-renew and self-repair and so on? Economic test, increase net worth. What this means is that you only do things that increase the value of your forest. The social test, does it build community cohesion? Well, I think with all the conflict we have, it wouldn't pass that test. And then cultural, I think it's only the First Nations who talk about this, but it's the test would be, will this alternative provide a life of security and meaning? Next, please. In winding up, it really doesn't have to be any more complex than this. Some of the First Nations people talk about the need for reciprocity, but here's Aldo Leopold with his bottom line assessment of the importance of conservation and how that manifests itself as an outcome. He says, when the land does well for the owner, okay, that's us, and the owner does well by their land, okay, When both end up better by reason of their partnership, we have conservation. When one or the other does poor, we do not. I'll leave that with you. Next, please. So in final, yeah, Greta Thunberg gets this. Our kids get this. The scientists get this. The Green Party gets this. But as far as I can tell, very few other people get this. But our Earth is highly vulnerable to collapse. And what it is in reality, this is a picture taken by the astronauts, the paper-thin atmosphere. You see that very thin layer of what we see, what is seen from space? I think there's a message there for us to reflect on. The COVID-19 is telling us that we're in a time of duress. And if we don't figure it out, I would expect more pandemics to occur, like H1N1 in the past, or Ebola or whatever. And the COVID-19 is the current one. We're blessed to live on this wonderful planet, but we also have a huge ethical responsibility to take care of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ray, and I really appreciate your bird's eye view of things and talking about things like principles and values and responsibility and accountability, and those are things that are definitely not part of the vision of our current forest managers in BC. So thank you so much. We're going to move on to Bob Williams' presentation right now. Welcome to Bob Williams. Bob Williams is a former Vancouver City Councillor and BC government cabinet minister who's had a long involvement with Van City Credit Union. He's passionate about community leadership, economic development, and progressive change. In BC, Bob Williams is perhaps best known for his distinguished career in politics, first as a Vancouver City Councillor from 65 to 66, and then as BC MLA for the constituency of Vancouver East from 66 to 84. And then between 1972 and 75, Bob was Minister of Resources in the government of former Premier Dave Barrett, and is most proud of his role in saving Blackcomb Mountain from logging and creating Whistler Town Centre. His efforts with renowned architect Arthur Erickson to create Robson Square in downtown Vancouver, and supporting the establishment of the Central City SFU project in Surrey City Centre, which won international awards. Bob was also instrumental in establishing 3 million acres of wilderness parks in BC, including Kalamalka Lake, Batsizi, and Naikun, among many others. More people know Bob as an avid supporter of the arts in Vancouver and as a former owner of the Railway Club in downtown Vancouver, a pioneering music venue where Katie Lang got her first gig out of Alberta. Bob has degrees in economics and city and regional planning from UBC, an honorary doctorate from SFU, and is a former volunteer senior research fellow with Van City. So Bob's presentation is up on the screen now, and just so that those of you who are watching know, Bob's screen title says Thomas Bevan. Thomas Bevan is Bob's colleague, but we are indeed listening to Bob. So Bob, I'll hand it right over to you.
Well, thanks very much. Yes, I appreciate following Ray because he gives a real sense of what forestry can be or should be in British Columbia, and we've worked together for many years hoping that we could change things. I should say that this is going to lead to the empowering of the regions of BC, and Ray has already talked about the ecogeological, the grand regions of BC and how they probably are representative of most of Canada. But at any rate, I liked what he said about we have to think like a mountain. Now that's a challenge, but let's balance it against what the corporations tell us. They talk about all of this just being fiber. Let's understand those two different views. It's fiber, whatever that is, as a commodity for a corporation, versus mountains, which are alive and are iconic in British Columbia. So I started out when I was much younger being sympathetic to E.F. Schumacher and small is beautiful. I continue to hold a lot of those views. And so empowering the regions of British Columbia begins to break the province down into these more natural representative areas such as Vancouver Island, for example, and provide them opportunity to think in the sub-regional way. That, I think, is where we have to go. And on the coast and the interior are the big different parts of the province. Okay, we've got the mission statement of the BC Forest Service. But that tells us you can do almost anything. You can drive a truck through any of our rules. And the Auditor General of British Columbia has looked at all this and said, this is shocking. It isn't requiring any of the responsibility that Ray talks about at all. And so they really do, to a great extent, what they want to do in terms of seeking fiber, instead of seeing us as the regions we are and the people we are. Next. You know, the corporations that we've relied on over the years have come and gone. So here's some names like Macmillan Bloedel, Wellwood, Crown Zellerbach, and so on. And so they've been reduced to a handful of corporations, 5 or 6, that dominate the entire province. And they really don't involve any of us in that process to speak of. And so it begs the question about whether some of the goals of Small is Beautiful or Leopold or some of the others can be achieved. When I was younger, I had the chance of getting to understand the Mission Municipal Tree Farm, which is the first community tree farm in the province. And I got to know those people who pioneered it for decades. And they learned that they learned on the job. Towns and people of the province aren't really able to learn on the job and adjust policy and accountability. In the case of Mission, they knew that replanting Douglas firs was not the answer. Yellow cedar up there in back of Mission in those windy crags was the better answer. And they went to Macmillan Bloedel, they went to the universities, and they asked about how you propagate yellow cedar. And the answer was nobody knew. Nobody knew. The people in Mission learned by working at it, and by chance and accident, actually accidentally put some of the seedlings in the freezer instead of the fridge, and then they realized that the freezing was a necessary part of how you propagate yellow cedar. That's profound, and we deny people that profundity, if you will. They don't get the chance to be indelibly involved with their own landscape and hinterland and make better answers and better communities as a result. Next. The system is broken. You know, after 100 years, the previous Liberal government eliminated the Forest Service as a forest service. They ended up forest research. Annual reports even were eliminated. And forest inventory is far behind. The chief forester was a person under political control. So we've continued to decline in terms of the nature of our forests. So switch to the next. We can compare ourselves now with other people around the world. The Swedes are the ones that have so much to teach us. They double the cut and they double the production, and yet they've got 50% more employment. But the amazing thing is they've got 50% more forest growing. So what are they doing? They're managing the forest, they're planting the forest, they're thinning the forest, they're fertilizing the forest. They're doing this tremendous job of improving the nature of their whole world of forestry. Next. And this kind of sums it up. when I was minister, hired Jaakko Poiri, a great Finnish consulting company in forestry. Ontario later on hired them as well to look at their work. And so Ontario had them look at the whole question of who manages forests best in Canada and America. And what you see in this chart is that BC fails in every category. We with the best forests in Canada and are the worst at managing them in terms of reforestation, in terms of research, in terms of training, and in terms of management. It's all there in that chart. That's a shocker for those of us that think everything's fine in BC. Next. So as you see here, Ontario does far better than us in value added, and so it's an extraordinary failure. We get puff pieces in the newspaper now and then telling us how well we're doing in forestry, and they're simply not true. Next slide. So as a result, rural life is impoverished in this province. You know, the smaller towns, the average towns are in decline, are not growing. Young people have to get out of that region and move to the coast or the metropolitan area. And First Nations are really not involved at all. So there's a real need to reach back to the models that we have that are good and exciting. So we have the municipal tree farm in Mission, and more recently we've had the Rebelstoke community tree farm as well, and there's a North Cowichan municipal forest and so on. And there's other good examples, but they're not covering much of our landscape. So we do have to look at what we can do in terms of freeing up the landscape for true involvement of local people and the greater productivity and humanity and community that represents. Next slide. So I've come to the conclusion, as a lot of my colleagues have, is that we have to create a forest charter. We don't want something that you can drive a truck through in terms of companies not caring about the landscape at all. So our forests are iconic. We can reach back to other people that care about the landscape in America since Leopold. And one of them is Wendell Berry in Kentucky, who sees agricultural people involved in the land and loving the land as a wonderful transformational exercise, both in terms of people and the landscape. We have to move more and more in a way that can free that up for a kind of a loving care about the landscape. And a forest charter could begin to do that. Next, the Columbia Basin Trust is an example of moving toward these macro regions and creating opportunities for people in those regions to manage them to a much greater extent. So what I see is the great macro regions of the province, like the Kootenays, Vancouver Island, the central interior, the north, becoming essentially regional macro self-management regions. And the Columbia Basin Trust, which does that now with water to a very great extent, might be expanded to do it with forestry. And we could have a combination of forest and water being essentially to a great degree managed by the people in that region. So next slide, that covers that item. Next slide, we need to create a Forester General because we have a politicalization of the whole professional side of forestry, and we've corporatized it and digitalized it and centralized it in many ways that mean we don't have access to information. And the Forester General would report to the legislature itself, just like the Auditor General does, and provide all the data that we really need. And that's not available to us now. So a Forester General would be a real breakthrough. But in turn, that would be within these macro regions that are roughly shown. Oh, the next one, the macro region that we have, and that we could work on to define to a greater extent. But at the same time, as these macro regions might well have committees of the legislature itself, so that the people that are MLAs from that macro region would become the people that the Forester General would report to around their data, and they in turn could have regional people in the region making a link. So we'd have a feedback loop between the people in the region and the legislators in the legislature and the Forester General, and it would become a fascinating way of democratizing governance of forestry in British Columbia. I think I can hold it there, and we can open for questions.
For sure, I was going to ask you about your work with the ALR and how communities can use that zoning mechanism to get no-go zones in the province. Sure.
Well, the people don't know the history of the how we achieved the ALR, and I had a deputy minister when I went into office who said to me, you know, there is a statute, minister, that could be useful for exceptional actions in areas where you're worried about things. Well, our Minister of Agriculture was worried about the saving of agricultural land, but what had happened is W.A.C. Bennett wanted a statute that would allow him to remove the authority of other statutes. In his case, he wanted to create a copper smelter, which is quite poisonous, terrible environmental impacts. And so he created the Environment and Land Use Act, which essentially said, if you want to carry out a major project, you use the Environment and Land Use Act to remove all the other statutes in that particular area. So the deputy said, so you can use it for evil or for good, minister. Well, we want to save agricultural land. We think that's good and an important long-term goal. And so we actually were able to take this hammer of a piece of legislation and use it to change all the rules forthwith in terms of saving agricultural land. So, you know, if we want to do something in forestry forthwith and not have it too complicated, you might, for example, say Vancouver Island will become a separate macro region where local people and a Forester General together determine the future policies on forestry on Vancouver Island. So with one sweep, you could actually be in the process of genuine, decentralized, sustainable forestry on Vancouver Island. So there's a way of reaching around some of the complications we now face with the corporations and work with the First Nations on the island, for example, and the regional people on the island, and create a whole new regime in terms of how we manage the forests of Vancouver Island. So it would be an ALR approach to forestry on a macro regional basis.
Just to clarify, Bob, our current ministers could use that environment and land use statute. So the Minister of Forests of Flinrod or the Minister of the Environment could use that statute at this time?
Yes, yes, any minister could use it with the authority of cabinet.
So it would just take some political will and bravery.
That's all. That's all.
And so it could be considered, you know, negligent if they don't protect forests. Ray Travers mentioned this idea for reserves for community watersheds, domestic watersheds, and recreation areas or areas at ecological risk. Bob, could you also talk about how you saved blackcomb from being clear-cut logged, and how what mechanism other maybe recreation communities can use in their backyards?
Well, in the case of blackcomb, our wonderful citizen Al Rain and Nancy Green let me know that the likelihood of logging on blackcomb was almost underway. I sent a forest ranger to meet with him, and then met with him and Nancy, and we concluded that the logging would have to stop. But in the process, we ended up bringing in experts from Colorado, advising us about climate and snow and skiability and all the rest of it. And so we took a really detailed analysis that led to the plan for Whistler and the subsequent resort municipality of Whistler. And we actually created a town council there that actually put a provincial representative on the town council, and that was Al Rain. He's continued to do great work like that up at Sun Peaks near Kamloops. But I think all that requires a hands-on capacity on the part of the professionals that are working on it. Dennis O'Gorman, who's now retired near you and has a place up on Apex, has all the skills for doing that. And it was Dennis that actually did the hard work and the detailed work on creating the modern Whistler. The modern Whistler is now 15% of our total tourism receipts in British Columbia. So we've got the skill to do it, but we're not applying the professional know-how in the exercise and in water management and the like. So we do need these really terrific professionals that can redefine with the local citizen the way we manage watersheds and recreational areas. It leaves quite a bit to be desired right now.
Okay, Taryn, do you have another question for Bob? And then I have a question for Ray, and we'll wrap up.
Yeah, I haven't asked Ray my question. So how about Ray, you've introduced yourself in public as a recovering forester. And I wanted just to ask about what was like growing up in British Columbia in McBride, and now looking at McBride and seeing the heavy forestry that's happened due to mountain pine beetle. You didn't give many examples of British Columbia as great forestry success stories. And actually, I think only Wildwood was mentioned, the 80 acres in the entire province. So could you discuss first mountain pine beetle and what you thought as a forester during the mountain pine beetle disaster? And then can you give some more ideas of what success stories are going to be happening in BC?
Yeah, thanks, Taryn. Lodgepole pine, which is the host for the mountain pine beetle, occurs in about 20% of the province. We always hear that, and we see it on TV of, these red drop trees from horizon to horizon. Well, that's true in perhaps the 20%, but it's not true in most of the rest of the province. I already introduced the idea of natural forces being part of the capability of forests to recover from stress. And obviously what happened to this lodgepole pine was that a lot of it was killed. And that looks really dramatic where you have only lodgepole pine, let's say pure species. But that's the minority. And there were people in the Prince George Quesnel area who tried to point out that selection logging, and that is moving in and taking the stress trees and leaving the best trees, usually of the other species, the spruce or the Douglas fir. And they weren't paid attention to. Some of them actually made it onto CBC, but that's about all that happened. So instead, what the province did is that it upped the AAC by 30%. They have this wonderful word called uplift. And if you look at that word in your dictionary, it means spiritually elevating, okay? Very clever use of words. any rate, they basically hammered that 20% of the province, and they're still at it. They're still at it if you watch the various stories that are coming out. And so, and the AAC is coming down dramatically in the Prince George area by at least a third, and I wouldn't be surprised if it comes down by a half by the time the logging is, and what that means is a lot of area, and really is, let's say 0 to 20-year-old age classes. Okay, well, getting back to growing up in McBride, yes, my notion as a young person was because I could see the importance of the local timber industry in terms of sawmills and horse logging, which my dad worked in some of the time. And I wanted to become a custodian of the forest. And of course, I haven't got very far on that role, and maybe that's why I'm delighted to participate in this today, because those instincts are still here in my my belief system. So getting back to examples, well, I think that the Creston Community Forest is probably a pretty good example. So is the Harrop Proctor, another pretty good example. They have a similar ethic and so on. And as far as I know, they're making as much money as any of the others. Now, that's not doesn't mean that it's easy, but the reality of the community forests, they're a very tiny percentage of the whole province. I think it's 1 or 2%. And so if we want to then really get to tackle the really big economic issue, are these regional monopolies. And there was a study done in the Future of Our Forest report in 1993, I think it was, or 92, with the commissioner, Sandy Peel. And basically the analysis that he had done by a skilled analyst from Vancouver, and he just used standard appraisal methods. He showed that our public timber at that time was undervalued by somewhere between 2 times and 4 times in one of the reports. And so, describe that in any way you want. But I think it's the underlying problem of the softwood lumber agreement. As one of the skilled people in the province said, with the softwood lumber tariffs, what the Americans are telling us, if we're not prepared to collect the stumpage at the source, then they will at the border.
Yeah.
And what's the final result of that? The American consumers pay more for our lumber. And I don't have a problem with that. Let them pay the full value of our wood. And then we would have the money to do all of these good things that we're talking about. So yeah, people, there are all kinds of good people in British Columbia who want to practice petty forestry, but they're not allowed to, especially the entrepreneurs who need access to the public timber so that they can make value-added products. So yeah, I think to my mind the path is clear, but the obstacles are many.
Thank you for giving those examples, Ray, Harrop Proctor, and Creston. And maybe just to finish off here, Bob, I'll ask you for an example. And I know you've talked about Rebelstoke, and there was certain individuals in Rebelstoke who stood up and took action. So what happened in Rebelstoke around forestry that impressed you?
It's a difficult area to start with. So it's in the interior wet belt, and it's a very steep mountains, and so operating in Rebelstoke is very difficult. But a range of people worked on getting that license, and in particular, the mayor of Rebelstoke, Dr. Battersby, who was a great power for decades in Rebelstoke, and he clearly realized that if they didn't get the tenure and licensing, they'd be out of business. And the mill in Rebelstoke is a significant employer, but it ended up becoming a very happy marriage between the private sector of good mill owners and operators and local people and good forestry practice. Jack Heavener is the wonderful manager there for the last couple of decades, and he, working in that difficult terrain, was able to create a very profitable mill and provide a lot of employment in the town. It was, and the present mayor of Revelstoke is equally happy with it. as a result of all that, Rob, in Cowichan City Council, was able to convince the UBCM last year that this was a great model and should be applied more broadly for the whole province. They actually approved that. So the folks in Rebelstoke have a lot to be proud of in terms of really maintaining employment, maintaining sustainability in very difficult terrain, and providing a new model for the whole province after.
Well, that's a great example of how local government officials can step up and get involved in forestry. And I've heard people in our local government people say, well, that's not something that we can tackle, but it is. It really is. Local government people can take that on and lead to job creation locally.
Absolutely, and you know, Ray and I are also familiar with Creston, and in Creston, where there's the other big enterprise is the brewery, Columbia Brewery. Well, the water was being all fouled up by big corporate not caring logging practices, and local people simply stopped it dead. They stopped it dead. They weren't going to let their water ended up being totally contaminated, another industry wasted. And so they ended up having to start over. And Jim Smith, wonderful forester in the province, was brought in to create the community forest management there. And they love the guy now. They know that he cares. But Jim has a wonderful background as well. He created the Vernon Lumbee log market, where they showed that when you created almost like a supermarket of all the logs and products from the forest, they got up to some 60 different products, all in their wood yard. And they ended up creating a whole new revenue and whole new range of opportunities. And that was Jim Smith's work. And he carried on similarly in Creston. Giving guys like that the opportunity, working with communities like those, it just transforms everything.
Excellent. Well, Jim Smith is going to be appearing in one of the other sessions in our summit. Thank you for those. Ray, one final question for you. I believe you had an example of a small group or some individuals who stepped up and got it done, and they implemented a different kind of forestry. Was it the
Menominee.
Menominee.
There we are.
Tell us about that example.
Sure. The Menominee were prairie people who got pushed off the prairies when the American settlers moved west. And they got pushed into the trees. And it became a matter of survival for them, that they understand how to exist as in their culture and as an economy. And so they started to practice selection logging. It's 250,000 acres. You can find it on the internet. There's a short video there that you can find, 4 minutes, where the forester Marshall Pecor leads people through it. And when you see the images in terms of the logging and the milling, it looks very industrial, you know, big trucks and mills cutting lumber and so on. But when they get into ethics, and when they get into excellence in forestry, and when they get into their commitment to the long term, it's a completely different world. And as Marshall Pecor says, that's what's unique about their community is that it's surrounded by trees. And then they show how all of the surrounding land, way back when, 100 years ago, was clear cut. And so they have transformed within their Native American culture to modern forestry, and they do, and they're very open. They have many of the planning tools that we have or should have, and have received numerous awards. They're constantly visited by people from all over the world to explain the quality of what they do. And what I think they're most proud of is that, and you see in the video, is that it's fully integrated with their Native American culture. They wind up with drum beating and dancing in the way that we're familiar with First Nations people, and we can do the same. You look on one of their websites. It's all about the quality of the wood that they have. And as Bob said, in BC, what do we could refer to the wood? Fiber. That is forest products nonsense. It means nothing, and it's probably intended to mean nothing when we start talking about, you know, what the potential is of our wood. And so there are numerous obstacles that are in the way of getting us to having a really clear conversation around that. But yeah, the Menominee are a marvelous example of what is possible in British Columbia, all of Canada. And I would highly recommend everyone pay a little attention to it.
Thank you. So any final words from you, Bob, as we all work together? Or Taryn, did you have a question?
Yes, I did have a question. I think it would be remiss if we didn't mention this report that Bob Williams wrote and Ray Travers did the research on. And it's all about what we're talking about now. You know, there are challenges to tell the truth about what's really going on in forestry. And Bob and Ray have come up with four needs or recommendations of, and they've mentioned already today the Forestry Charter and the Forestry General, but it's generally all about decentralizing the timber industry in BC. So I was wondering if they could just give some final words about their report. It's a year and 8 months now, and how do they see it? Has changed at all? Could they add to it, or what's working in this, the story of industry's decline in BC?
I'm overjoyed that you folks have picked it up and clearly understand it and support it. Ray was responsible for the appendix, so all of those detailed items in the appendix about productivity and numbers in Sweden are all gathered by Ray, so we know it's an RPF that's done that. The body of the report is a result of a lifetime's experience in terms of my view of British Columbia over a long period of time, and how exciting it was when I was working in the forest in early days, and people in local forestry green and white barns were the leaders of the community, working with local people that were practicing forestry right in their own immediate neighborhood. If we can only reach back to a more meaningful way of freeing people up to work that territory that's right under their feet, then we will transform this province, as both Ray and I think we have to do.
If I could just conclude by saying quickly that I think the way to appeal to the industry is, let's bring to the table our strengths and let us talk about what real strengths are. And as I think about the industry, yeah, they're very good at running mills. They're very good at mechanization, if that's a strength, but I can't really think of many other reasons why I would identify strengths from the industrial sector. We know where that's taken us. But I think that's a big place to start. Let's bring our strengths to the table and build a better British Columbia.
Excellent, thank you so much. And that is what we are trying to do with this summit, to synergize opportunities and strengths, and all of us come together and move forward, sort of empower the movement, and so that we all work together to get this done. Thank you so much, Ray Travers and Bob Williams. Thank you, Terence Galbania. And let's all move forward together with some more of the great information that you've shared with us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well.
Jennifer.